One mistake that I've seen people make repeatedly is that they focus on buying the grade and not the book. And there are some out there that heard me make this declarative statement and have already assumed that I'm talking specifically about graded comics when that's not necessarily accurate. More than likely, you've set foot in a comic shop and you've seen books on a wall. And oftentimes those books will have some grades written on them by that comic shop owner. They may write F for fine or VF for very fine, and in your mind, you automatically translate that grade into a specific defect. We literally do this all the time. Likewise, there are folks out there that see a graded comic and automatically assume, for example, that a 9.8 is a perfect book. Over the course of this video, what I hope to be able to demonstrate is why you should ignore the grade and focus on the book, whether it be raw or graded. One thing that we might want to consider is thinking about comic book grades as bands. Bands are comprised of several permissible defects and impactful defects. And yes, I am making an important distinction here that I'll explain. Permissible defects are things like wavy paper, distributor overspray, bindery tears, date stamps, things that are part of the production and distribution of comics. Things that don't necessarily impact the grade of a comic, but are permissible within bands. I'm contrasting these things to defects like blunted corners, tears, spine ticks, missing pages, things that will absolutely impact a comic's grade and will ultimately be the reason why a comic receives one grade versus another. I'm suggesting that we think of comic book grades in terms of bands, because when you dig into the data and you look at the guidelines that exist for comic book grading, what you see is that there are a lot of different permissible defects as well as impactful defects that will be visible in a grade. In fact, when you look at the CBCS guidelines for fine, which is defined as a book that ranges from a 7.0 to a 5.5, you can see that there are a lot of different defects that can contribute to a book falling within this specific band. Now compare that to how Overstreet defines a 7.0 to a 5.5. Again, here you see lots of variations. And so that's why we have to think of this in terms of bands versus a specific defect that will result in a book getting this grade versus that grade. There are lots of defects that will contribute to making that happen. We need to move away from this notion that a specific defect will always result in a book receiving a specific grade. Once upon a time, there was this rumor out there that a book with a subscription crease was always going to be a 5.0. That's not necessarily true, but what I can tell you is that certain defects like subscription creases will put a cap on a book, but that does not mean that that book will always be at the upper end of that cap. The same thing can be said for defects like tape. And I've actually received this question from people a fair bit where folks have assumed that because a comic has tape on it, that comic is automatically going to get a 3.0. That is not necessarily true. In fact, when you look at CBCS's grading scale, what you see is that a comic can have tape and can receive a grade anywhere from a 1.0 all the way up to a 7.0. Just like the other example that I gave a few moments ago, a book's final grade will be determined by an evaluation of all present defects. And it will be all of those defects that ultimately determine the grade that a book gets. And this is why it's important to look at the comic, look at the book itself, not necessarily the grade, because there could be some grades, some defects that are more desirable than others. To that point, one important factor that we cannot overlook is desirability. At the end of the day, you could have two comics that have the exact same grade, And you could have one of those books that is much more desirable versus the other because of the presence or lack of one defect versus another. Specifically, when you look at 9.8s, you might assume that that book is perfect simply because it has a label on it that says it is a 9.8. When you look at the guidelines for a 9.8, what you see is that there isn't much detail for a description, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a band here that should be considered. This goes back to something that I said earlier about permissible defects that do not impact grade, however, could have an impact on desirability. Miswraps, for example, are something that will affect the desirability of one comic versus another. Here are a couple of raw and graded comics that are great overall but present with miswrap covers that could be problematic for some type of collectors. So it's important that when you are considering a comic that you do not just look at the grade. You actually have to look at the book that is inside of the plastic. And it doesn't matter whether it's a hard case graded plastic or if you're talking about a polyback or a mylar. You have to look beyond the grade to the actual comic. I also want to make mention of double covers. This is something that I don't think that I've ever spoken about in a previous video in any way, shape, or form, so I want to talk briefly about double covers. For those that don't know, a double cover can happen during the manufacturing process, whereby which two covers are bound to the exact same comic. This is not considered a defect and is actually highly desirable by some collectors due to the rarity of this actually happening. And specifically in high grades, this is something that people will look for. I personally do not collect double covers, but I can see the appeal of it. At the end of the day, a double cover, which is a production defect, does not affect the grade of the comic per se, and is actually permissible at every single grading band. I want to make mention of a few other things that you should consider if you are buying comics. A few other things that will hopefully justify why you need to focus on the book and not just on the label. The very first thing that I want to make mention of is Newton rings. And this is a phenomenon that occurs when two different pieces of plastic with different refractory indexes are placed together. And this results in a rainbow effect, a rainbow pattern, or some also describe it as like an oil slick that appears on the comic when you look through the plastic. The truth of the matter is that Newton rings are not harmful to the comic in any way, shape, or form. This is an effect, however, that will impact some collectors' desire to own one book versus another. And I've seen numerous times people make the mistake of buying a graded comic simply by looking at the label, simply from looking at the front of the book. And then they get the book and they hold it at an angle and they actually see Newton rings and they don't like it. And so if you're buying books, you definitely want to try to ask for some additional photos, even if it is a graded comic. You want to look in the description to see if there are any notations around Newton rings being present. Yes, you can get this fixed by sending the book back to CGC and having them reholder, but that takes time, that takes money, and you may want to avoid that simply by asking a few upfront questions before making a purchase. The second thing that I want to make mention of is paper memory and reversion. These are essentially the same thing. But reversion happens when a comic is not properly pressed or not fully pressed. It can actually revert to its pre-press status. So for example, if someone has a comic that has lots of pressable defects in the front cover and that comic is not properly pressed, within a few hours or a few days, that comic could revert to its pre-pressed state. Now, we don't know the proximity of time between a book being pressed and a book being graded. So when we get a comic or when we buy a comic, we cannot necessarily assume that that comic hasn't reverted. when we're looking through the plastic and we're evaluating the pressable defects, there is a chance that that comic could have been pressed, could have been graded before it actually reverted. And so this is just something that I want to flag for folks. I want folks to be aware that reversion is a real thing, so that when they're buying comics, they are taking some of these things into consideration. At the end of the day, this video and other videos on the channel are all designed to help you to make sense of comic book collecting. My hope is that this video is kind of added to your understanding of the hobby and will put you in a position to make more informed and better decisions. As always, if you need to reach out to me, feel free to do so on Instagram at Regie Collects. Take care.